Welcome everybody to Demolition and Deconstruction to Promote a Sustainable Future, an example in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm Jeanette Hansen. I'm with the Environmental Protection Agency in Region 5, which is also known as the Great Lakes region. And I'm glad that you could attend. I want to go over some logistics for today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded, as was yesterday's webinar if you were on that one. And we will be making it available for future viewing. The details of how to get that recording will be emailed to all registered participants after the webinar is over. All attendees are muted to reduce any background noise. But if you have any questions, please submit them via the chat, and we'll respond at the end of the presentations to your questions. Any questions that can't be answered in the allotted time we have will be answered through emails. Well, EPA saw a need to develop a tool due to the significant number of demolitions that were occurring across the nation, and especially in our region. You can just look at the national data that we have. Even before the foreclosure crisis, 250,000 housing units were being demolished in the United States each year. Between 2000 and 2010, vacant housing units grew by 44%, and we know that some of those vacant units would have to be demolished. In 1 year, in 2009, there was over 85 million tons of waste from demolitions. And again, this is before the foreclosure crisis. So we saw a need to develop a tool for local governments to manage the amount of debris that was going to be generated by demolitions, and also to show opportunities that exist to salvage and recycle those materials. So in September 2013, EPA Region 5 issued this toolkit to help local governments in our region improve their demolition practices so that sites would be ready for reuse. And you can see this document is available for total download at the website that is shown here, and we will be sending that link out to you again as part of the follow-up. Now, development of this tool involved many EPA programs. It provides a menu of tools for developing bid specifications to address a variety of issues that affect the overall environmental footprint of the demolition, as well as the ability to reuse the sites afterwards. These range from ensuring the use of good quality soils for backfill, to controlling dust, to protect worker and public health, and to salvaging and recovering materials. Today, you're going to be hearing about one great example of using all aspects of this tool in Cincinnati, Ohio. Our presenters today are down in Cincinnati. They are Andrew Reynolds, Chris Madej, and David Rich. So we're going to be handing it off to them for their great presentation.
All right, well, thank you, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone on the call today, depending on where you are. Thank you especially to those of you who may have joined an hour early, not seeing that the invite was for Central Time today. My name's Andrew Reynolds, and as she said, I'm an environmental planner with RA Consultants, but I serve as staff supplementation for the Metropolitan Sewer District of Greater Cincinnati, and I am the project manager for our demolition project. And as some of you may be thinking right now, why is the sewer district doing a demolition project of this scale? And I'll get into those details in just a minute. Throughout this presentation, I'll be passing the baton back and forth between myself and the two other gentlemen on the call today from Building Value, a local deconstruction firm. They are Chris Madej and David Rich. And we'll be passing it back and forth as we go along. But I will start us off today with the background of what our project is and why we are doing demolition and deconstruction. After that, we'll get into the specifics of our process. So I think we decided it would be of value to go through, even though it's somewhat specific to the city of Cincinnati and Hamilton County and the way we're set up as an organization, we still thought it would be valuable to go through how we set up contracts and actually executed those contracts, awarded bids for the various stages of the project from abatement to demolition. So I will go over those details with Chris and David's help. And then I'll also provide a summary of the results, kind of the waste streams that we were tracking to some extent during this project, and our lessons learned. So a background about MSD. We are under a federal mandate or consent decree to reduce our combined sewer overflows. And those combined sewer overflows are basically throughout our system and in many cities in the Midwest. As many of you are probably aware, we have combined sewers which carry both sanitary and storm flows through the same pipe. And so that system works as it's intended, and it overflows into local waterways during some times of the year, especially during rain events. So in our area, we have a particularly difficult challenge because we have about 11 billion gallons of that overflow that occurs every year. That's what the consent decree addresses, and we have multiple projects that are in the works right now to address that, and many that are also planned for the future. Many of those overflows in Cincinnati go into the Mill Creek, which is kind of the central urban stream that runs north-south through our area and follows I-75, if you're familiar with this area. The name we've given to our program for addressing our wet weather overflows is Project Groundwork. And as I mentioned, it includes hundreds of sewer projects and stormwater projects throughout Hamilton County and MSD's service area. What's unique about our approach, and what actually is good news is becoming less unique and more cities are adopting a similar approach, is that we use a combination of green and gray infrastructure. And that's shown to be successful in the modeling and analysis we've done, that we can get similar benefits from green infrastructure solutions that we would have gotten from more expensive gray infrastructure solutions, such as building large storage tunnels underground to store those CSO volumes. But even with cheaper green infrastructure, these are very expensive programs. The first phase of our consent decree is estimated to be about $1.37 billion, and that's in 2006 dollars, 2006 just being a way we can keep estimates consistent from one year to the next, so everything is de-escalated back to 2006. And then after 2018, we enter phase 2, which is going to cost an additional $1.2 billion as it's currently estimated. This map gives those of you who are not familiar with the Cincinnati area a little bit of an overview of the areas we're going to be talking about today. So as you can see, we're located in the southwest portion of the state of Ohio. And one of the things that's unique about our wet weather plan is that we focus on the watershed scale. So not just individual CSO points throughout the county, of which there are more than 200. We focus on individual watersheds and prioritize them based on a number of factors, but one of them being kind of which CSOs are the worst based on the watershed. So Lick Run is the home of the largest CSO in our service area, CSO number 5, which of the 11 billion gallons that our entire system endures every year, the one CSO that is at the base of the Lick Run watershed accounts for almost 1 billion of that 11. So it's a major issue, and that's one of the focus areas in our phase 1 consent decree response. To give you some context, that watershed is very close, just a couple miles away from downtown Cincinnati. The eastern portion of the Lick Run watershed feeds directly into Mill Creek, so that's where the project we'll be describing today takes place, because that's where the majority of the watershed drains to. You can't see it from this aerial image, but the topography is actually quite steep in this area, so a lot of the water drains quickly, and it drains a very large area to a very small central point at the base of that valley. Building Value's retail store is also very close by to this project, and that was another benefit of using their services to help us with this project. And though I haven't marked it specifically on the map, EPA's research facility here in Cincinnati is also located in this vicinity, approximately halfway in between Building Value's store and downtown Cincinnati. So the partnership makes a lot of sense. So as I mentioned, there is a central valley at the bottom of the Lick Run watershed, and I've zoomed into it here to give you a better idea. This is what currently exists there today, and I'm going to let the slide start to move from west to east, moving towards the Mill Creek. So as you can see, there's a mix of uses that currently exist, and it's relatively dense. There are active gas stations, fast food restaurants, but immediately adjacent to those are buildings that have been here for over 100 years and are potentially eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. We have auto repair facilities. We have city park space. We have large lot transportation users. And we also have city facilities, including a firehouse at the far eastern end of the corridor. So there's a variety of uses, and each of them understandably provide different challenges for us to address on a demolition project, because not all of these buildings will have to be demolished to make way for our project, but many of them do, and some of them, like auto repair facilities or fast food restaurants, have elements that can't even be seen above the ground. So there's underground storage tanks, and there's also throughout this area an existing combined sewer that is about 19.5 feet in diameter that runs through the northern portion of the corridor, and that will stay in place. But what our ultimate project in this watershed will do is separate a bunch of the stormwater that currently feeds into that existing combined sewer pipe and daylight it in an urban waterway that will go directly into the Mill Creek, which is seen on the far right side of this slide. And so what I'll show you on the next slide is this same corridor, but overlaid with the renderings we've done for what our project will be. So we're going back to the top or the western edge of the corridor. From west to east, this corridor is a little under a mile in length, but it's anywhere from 150 to 400 feet in width, so it's very narrow. So some of the solutions we'll be doing include a wetland forebay and some rain gardens to trap some of the initial overland flow and some of the nearby separation projects, because on these major streets you see coming off from the north and south this corridor, that is where we are actually currently constructing some stormwater sewer separation projects. And so the stormwater that's separated from those multiple projects on the hillsides of this watershed will be what primarily feeds this urban waterway, which daylights there in the center of the screen as I'm showing it now. So similar to the last slide, I'll advance this one to let you kind of see how this waterway is envisioned at the moment. And you can see how, based on the previous slide and the number of buildings that existed, the amount of demolition we're talking about. We're looking at removing approximately 75 buildings throughout this corridor, leaving a couple dozen behind, but the majority will have to be demolished over the next few years because construction of this project will begin in the spring of 2016. And so the result of doing it this way and removing these volumes of stormwater from the combined sewer pipe is that we're expecting to see a reduction in combined sewer overflows at CSO5, which is located at the far east corner of this, or far east side of this screen. Reductions in about a little over 600 million gallons of combined sewer volume. So if you remember, it currently overflows about 1 billion gallons, so that would be almost a 2/3 reduction. And this is just another rendering of what that waterway would look like. It's intended to be a naturalized looking stream. However, the system is more advanced than that because underneath this system is a box conduit which is going to carry the majority of that flow during wet weather events, so that it controls flood elevations at the surface and provides better public safety. And I'm sure the valley conveyance system that I've described here has enough that it could fill 3 or 4 webinars on its own, so I'm going to leave it at that for now. But if you have more questions or information you'd like to have about this project, you can go to our website, msdgc.org or projectgroundwork.org. But now we'll get specifically into the demolition work. Here's a close-up of some of the buildings that we see in this corridor. As you can see, it's a pretty good mix of building types, ages, styles, and land uses. So you have auto shops, you have buildings that were built in the last couple decades, and then similarly buildings that may have been built over a century ago. So it provides a lot of different challenges, but once we discovered that this scale of demolition was going to be required to make this project work. We wanted to reach out to agencies such as Building Value that we knew could help us reduce the amount of waste we were sending to the landfill and really get as much benefit out of these buildings as we could. So at this time, I'll turn it over to David Rich, the Director of Building Value, to explain their organization and what they do.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Building Value is a social enterprise that at its core is a workforce development program. We chose the method by which we do our training to be deconstruction, which is the systematic unbuilding of any structure to maximize the salvage and minimize the waste. And as a result of the amount of deconstruction that we're able to do, we started a retail center that allows us to take the deconstructed materials, turn them around, and sell them, the proceeds of which go to support our program. We are a social enterprise, wholly owned social enterprise of Easter Seals Tri-State. Easter Seals is a national organization whose mission is to enable those with disabilities and disadvantages to live independent lives, and that is also our core mission. The deconstruction revenues, because it is a fee-for-service that we provide, combined with the sales of the materials at our store, is what helps fund our program. We have since started a landscaping program and a lot and building stabilization program that generates revenues as well. But the retail store and the partial and whole structure deconstruction business is the largest portion of what we do. With the cuts in federal funding to almost every program that's out there, our goal is to become financially independent. We don't get any government grants or funding, I should say. We do apply for a lot of private and public grants to supplement the income, and so through those three methods is really how the program is funded. And we'll get into the details of the retail store because although I said at the core of what we do is workforce development, we feel any successful deconstruction program needs to have a retail center. And we'll get into some of those, the particulars later on. But at kind of a 40,000-foot elevation looking at it, it provides us with customers. And it provides us exposure, word of mouth, advertising, and the single biggest thing is that it allows us to do deconstruction because it provides us an opportunity to convert salvage items into cash. And almost in every case, the people who we do deconstruction for end up being customers at our store, and vice versa. So it's a good way of sharing resources between the two programs, the retail and the deconstruction. Our program for workforce development doesn't have specific time frames. Our goal is to find people work after they've been with Building Value for anywhere between 6 and 9 months. The process we employ is really work hardening. We pay folks minimum wage, and we do various tasks from cleaning out buildings that are going to be renovated to going in and taking out kitchen cabinets to full structure deconstruction. And if somebody is excelling in our program, we will hopefully find them placement before the 9 months is over. If someone is in our program for over 9 months or up to 12 months, it generally means that they haven't succeeded in our program, and we try and transition them out of the program, hopefully finding them work, but if not, we have to move on and bring more people into our program to reach more candidates. When we bring people into the program, unlike our parent Easter seals, we are not looking for folks with physical disabilities. We're working with folks who have traditional barriers to employment, which is typically at-risk youth, folks with little to no education, housing, and transportation issues. The liability is just too great for us to have folks with physical disabilities on a job site when you're working around 30,000-pound pieces of equipment. Probably the greatest challenge that we face, specifically Chris Madej, and he may touch on it later, is we are trying to bring people in our program and get them out as fast as possible. So we're taking our best and our brightest and getting rid of them as fast as we can. And again, when you're working in deconstruction, which is taking a building apart mechanically and by hand, it's a dicey proposition. And so one of the biggest challenges we have to do this successfully is working with new people constantly, folks who aren't trained in this type of work, and keeping them safe all at the same time.
Thanks, David. This is Andrew again. I'm going to go back and forth a little bit, as I mentioned at the top, just because we're trying to follow here in this presentation kind of the chronological order that we addressed some different issues as we went through this project. So very early on, as I mentioned, we could tell the history of the buildings was important, not only just visibly from the outside, but when you talk to members of the community, it was clear that there are a lot of stories wrapped up in some of these buildings that may not look like much from the outside. Similarly, others clearly have a history just from taking a glance at them. So what we did was we contracted with Gray and Pape, who is a cultural resource consultant here in the Cincinnati area, to do really a full investigation of the entire corridor. At this time, we don't have any federal mandates to do what would be called a 106 historic review process, Section 106. But what we've tried to do is mimic that, because the way this project works is we don't know with certainty that we would not have to meet those kind of guidelines in the future. So what we've attempted to do is mimic that approach in what we've done to date. So what Gray and Pape's report told us was that of the buildings in this corridor, there are some that are potentially eligible for the National Historic Register, or the National Register of Historic Places, rather. There's one structure outside the area of impact of our project that is already listed on that register. So then with that information, we were able to go back, meet with the community on multiple occasions, and develop an impact mitigation plan that we're hoping to implement. That will not necessarily protect every building that's potentially historic from demolition, because in some cases it's physically not possible to move buildings out of the way. The area is just too cramped to either to get underneath them and support them, or the buildings themselves are just not in the condition to be moved. But we are looking into those kind of options, but we're also looking at the other end of the spectrum and doing more property documentation, interviews with residents just to build the history, and then looking at ways that we can incorporate the history of this neighborhood and these buildings into maybe some signage or a cultural trail with the final urban waterway project. So once again, this is a topic that could fill its own webinar given the time, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that we are incorporating these concerns into the project, and it was done from a very early stage. So again, this is our approximate timeline, and I hesitated to put in actual durations here because obviously results may vary, because we are a unique entity in that the Metropolitan Sewer District of Greater Cincinnati is owned by Hamilton County but operated by the City of Cincinnati, and that duality provides unique challenges when we're trying to get projects funded and approved. So what I've tried to do here is kind of skim over the steps that I think are probably unique to Cincinnati. The first of which would just be the timeline it takes from when we request project funding to when we actually obtain it. And one of the other things that I'm not putting on the timeline specifically here, but you see at the top of the list, is the City of Cincinnati and MSD each have their own master service agreements. I'm guessing that's not unique, but we have a master service agreement list at MSD for demolition services, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. Similarly, the City of Cincinnati has an MSA for asbestos abatement services, so we're able to kind of pull from those different pre-approved or vetted lists of contractors, and that does speed up the process because we're not always having to go to full public bids on some of these things. And in some cases, we're able to do direct award. So with that said, the overall timeline is kind of what we'll be walking through on the next few slides. But basically, this first phase of demolition, we knocked down 20 buildings. That was this past month one, as it's listed there, was May of 2013, so last year. And we just completed the final demolitions just in January of this year. There were multiple steps in that process, so if you take nothing else away from this slide, take away that it's not just a matter of getting funding and then knocking buildings down. There are lots of steps that are required in between, permitting and other things that have to take place. We probably added some steps to this that other cities could probably avoid. I think one of the things we've learned that we'll discuss later is kind of maybe how some of these steps can be combined just to reduce some additional time. But there's also things you can never expect. Weather, we had a particularly cold and snowy winter here in Cincinnati this year, so when normally having the construction season go into November and December wouldn't pose any problems, this year it did. And we'll get into that later, but I just wanted to show you the overall timeline of how we'll be going through the rest of the presentation. So a little more detail on our contracting approach for abatement. As I mentioned, the City of Cincinnati has existing master service agreements for abatement firms. The step from the previous slide that I actually did not list was the asbestos investigations, because those were actually conducted in 2012. Unique circumstances there. The funding for those was conducted through a different project. So those were done before we had funding for the demolition itself, but in the future we would conduct that as part of the demolition phase. So we had a contractor go out to each of the buildings we were planning to demolish, survey them for asbestos-containing other hazardous materials, and then that company produced specifications that were later given to two different abatement firms, I should say, to conduct the work itself in the spring and summer of 2013. I'm not sure when that precedent was established of having a different firm do the investigations and the work itself, but it does provide some benefits in that you have extra pairs of eyes looking for those materials. So the abatement firm that did the survey and the investigations was part of the walkthrough before the bidding, so they were there to be able to discuss with the firms who were going to conduct the work and what the findings were and what might have been missing, or what, if there was anything that was missed, they could discuss it with them and adjust the specifications accordingly. Because MSD as a sewer district is not in the position to write abatement specifications. That's the reason we have to use their services. Next, the contracting approach for demolition. Similarly, we have MSD has master service agreements that were created for the first time in 2011. It was a public or an open request for local firms to submit their qualifications, and from those almost 24 firms that submitted, we narrowed it down to a list of 7 firms. The contracts or MSAs basically have all the standard contracting language, so the insurance, those kind of terms, but also the basic scope items that would be anticipated for demolition projects, so that when projects actually come up on an as-needed basis, it's easier to write those task orders or certify funds, and it reduces some of that administrative time. And the way those contracts are set up is in 2-year terms with additional 1-year extensions. What we discovered soon after that, though, was that we didn't really have any firms in that original MSA list for specifically demolition services that could do deconstruction, additional material salvage. So that was when we started discussions with Building Value. So in 2013, we had a new MSA signed with Building Value for demolition and deconstruction services, which was basically very similar to the MSA language in the first, or in the demolition, traditional demolition MSA, but we added additional items to their scope, such as deconstruction and additional salvage things that were not included in the traditional demolition. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Chris Madej from Building Value, who's going to talk through the initial deconstruction that was done.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is Chris Madej, Deconstruction Manager at Building Value. Okay, so MSD had a large amount of buildings to take down, and they knew they wanted to, salvage and save, parts of these buildings. So they came to us for help. Before we could do anything, obviously we had to go look at all these buildings and see what was there. Sounds easy enough, but it was actually pretty time-consuming and sometimes dangerous process. We went around, we took notes on what was in there, looking for highlights, things like antique, mantles, railings, doors, things like that. While we were walking around in there, we were assessing these buildings to see if they're good candidates for full structure deconstruction, as well as looking for items that were a little easier to take out of there. So what makes a good candidate for deconstruction? The picture here is actually one of the houses from the project, and it's one of the better candidates. When we're looking for houses to deconstruct, we're looking for older houses, generally about 100 years or older. These houses have the old growth lumber in there, which is a much higher quality lumber. All the flooring and finishes are generally higher quality. The foundations are stone, which is quite a bit easier to dismantle them than it would be a poured concrete foundation. We're looking for little shorter buildings. When they're over 3 stories, you really kind of need a crane to get materials down safely from that high. Buildings with shallow basements or no basements, ideally, that's less site work, less filter you have to bring in. We need working room around the buildings. It's ideal. A lot of these houses had vacant lots next to them where a house was previously demolished, and that's really ideal. We need this space so we can load materials, so our equipment can pull sections of floor and wall out of the way so our crew can disassemble them without being right underneath the equipment, and for loading and unloading and bringing trucks in. We're looking for wood frame buildings generally, kind of going back and forth on this because you can salvage some good lumber out of the brick buildings as well. Looking for minimal site work. Examples of that would be large concrete pads, big dead trees, things of that nature. The more time our equipment's spending doing site work, the less time we're spending salvaging building materials. And another thing is a gradual roof slope is good. We like to start from the top and work our way down when we're hand disassembling things. So, if it's a really steep roof, that poses a bit of a challenge. That said, you don't find many perfect deconstruction candidates. So really what you're doing is you're going around, you're looking at buildings, you're assessing the pros and the cons of the buildings, and seeing if the pros outweigh the cons. The picture here is another house from the project. Not perfectly ideal, a little taller than we'd like. Brick, so there's more weight to it. Power line really close in front of it. It had a really deep basement. So there's some negatives. Not a huge lot either. But, some of the positives of this building, the pictures to the right is a decorative iron fence that was all around the building, which is beautiful and ornate. There's chimney caps were on top of it. The whole building was full of heart pine flooring. We've got a buyer who's got a large order for that, so we could take that out and send it all to him. The lumber in it was really nice. So, not the perfect candidate, but still ended up being a really good project for us. So, this is an example of some of the things we went and took out before the whole deconstruction process happened. Basically what happened, we figured out that we weren't going to be deconstructing all of the buildings. But we had done the walkthrough and we realized there was a lot of great materials in there, and we didn't want them all to go to the landfill. So we sat down with MSD and figured out it would be best if we went through before the demolition work went out to bid, and we went through and we took out architectural antiques and things of value from in there. This is a list of some of the things that we took, and there was more than this as well, but this just gives an example of the kind of things that we're looking for. We're looking for things with, kind of intrinsic value due to age or uniqueness. tin ceiling was a great example. There's beautiful tin ceiling in a lot of the buildings, ornate mantles, things like that. You know, a lot of that's pretty obvious, but the pine flooring is really nice and quite valuable as well. We're also looking for things that are a little easier to get. You know, if there's 3 layers of floor over the hard pine flooring, it's probably not worth the time to remove all the other floor to get the floor. But so you're looking for things that are a little easier to access, and on top of that, you're looking for things that you know are saleable. You know, by being in business for 10 years, we've kind of learned what sells when it comes to the store and what doesn't. So we want to focus our efforts on things that we know we can sell. You know, removing items from a building is great, but if you don't find an end user for those items, you know, there's not a whole lot of a point to it. So just some examples of where some of these materials went. A customer came in, and I was talking to him recently, and he bought a large old brewery called the Jackson Brewery down in a historic part of downtown Cincinnati. This was built in 1859. He's doing a remodel of it, and he wants to leave all the framing and everything exposed. He doesn't want any drywall in the building. So every place where the floor is rotted through, he has to replace that with the old lumber. You know, the only place you can get that is by taking an old building down. So we took about 6,000 square feet of pine flooring to him and a huge amount of lumber from these buildings on Queen City from this project. The picture on the right is an example. That's the underside of the roof, which they replaced with pine tongue and groove flooring from these properties. And you know, that way the underside of the roof, it looks a lot better than new OSB would. And you know, the rafters are also reused as well. So you know, finding buyers like that is just a huge positive for us because it gives us an outlet for a large amount of salvage materials. Besides that, we also share some of the materials with the South Fairmount Cincinnati Reuse Center. That's a reuse center that's right around the corner from where this project took place. You know, they didn't necessarily have the capacity to do the deconstructions themselves, but you know, we try to get along with everyone, so we talked with them and wanted to keep some of the items in the neighborhood where they came out from. So we actually worked a trade with them where we traded for some appliances and things like that we could sell, and in exchange gave them some antiques from this project. And lastly, items came to the building value retail store. We set up a large display there and kind of had a little note there about where the items came from, talked about the project a little bit. And this was good PR for MSD, and it was also good advertising for building value. We had a whole lot of luck selling these items, and MSD actually put out a coupon to local residents and some of their stakeholders, which you know, which has served as further PR. You know, helped bring more buyers into our store. And you know, talking to the buyers and telling them the story, the buyers really seem to you know, start to get a feeling that MSD did actually care about these buildings and was making a real concerted effort to save items out of them and kind of putting their money where their mouth was. So yeah, that's a great thing for everybody involved.
So yeah, and I apologize for not making it clear when I was talking about the slide on the timeline. As Chris mentioned, we did identify early on that we wanted to have building value get into as many of the buildings as possible to do what we were calling selective deconstruction. So kind of maybe not low-hanging fruits, probably not giving them enough credit for how much work it still took to get it out of there, but because there were 20 buildings, we decided that we wanted to break this project up into three different phases, but rather 3 different contractors, just to make a reduced schedule, reduce the traffic impacts. This is a very high traffic area with buildings right up to the street. So every time we have to demolish a building, we're usually closing a lane for the portion of the day. So by having multiple contractors working at once, we were hoping to be able to kind of combine those delays, those impacts. But it's also really the first chance we get to test out our MSA list. So of those 7 firms, we actually ended up being able to invite 6 of the traditional demo firms to give us bids on this first phase, phase A, as well as building value. So traditionally with that MSA list, we would just bid if we had a single building, as is usually the case for our sewer district. There will be a single building that needs to get demolished on a particular project. We would just give that to the next 3 of the 7 on the list. So whoever was awarded the previous project goes to the bottom, and it just keeps rotating back to the top. So this way, on this project alone, we were able to get almost every single contractor involved, or at least with an opportunity to bid. So we provided a pretty detailed bid package to all the bidders that included just some of the items. Demolition specifications, I'll get more into those in just a minute. Maps, a template of a waste hauling log. This was the first time we'd used that, and I'll also show that later in the presentation. Plan and profile drawings of where the sewer was located, a template for how to return the bids, and we were also able to lead each group on walkthroughs of the individual buildings. Our internal estimating group conducted independent cost estimates of what each building would cost to demolish beforehand. So when we got these estimates back, they ranged quite a bit, both above and below our internal estimates, because it's difficult to estimate based on square footage alone. But that was another reason why bidding them out in groups and not just as individual buildings was advantageous, because it kind of helps you erase those differences from one building to the next. So if you have one building that was over, one building that was under, it kind of made that a wash. So overall, the contract totals were within kind of what we estimated. And so again, before the bid groups were even created, we had building value go in and rank their most desirable buildings for deconstruction, because, as I said, as the only MSA we have for deconstruction, their bids weren't going to be against anyone else. So it's going to be more of a direct award situation. However, we still had the right to refuse or not use their services if their bids ended up coming back well above our estimates. We kind of pegged it at 10%. If they were inside our estimate by 10%, we were going to award them the work for the full structures, and as it happened, all of their bids were. So we were able to award that work to them directly, but we also wanted to make sure that the buildings we were giving them to deconstruct were ones they actually had an interest in. So that was an important step to have that conversation beforehand. And so I mentioned the specifications. We definitely referred to the new EPA residential demolition specifications. As a matter of fact, we were actually in discussions with them while that document was still draft. We sent them our standard specifications and got very valuable comments and responses back from their team on suggestions for improvement. We were not able to incorporate everything they suggested, only because we were not sure, this being a unique project for us, exactly how much it was going to cost. So some of the items we weren't sure if it was going to add cost or not. So I think now moving forward, now that we have the actuals for Phase A, we'll know more going into Phase B on maybe adding some additional details. But what we did include were requirements that we'd never included before on our projects for tracking of waste streams. We had contractors were tasked with documenting each truck that left the site and estimating the volume and or weight of the materials inside and the type of materials and which facility they were heading to. We changed some of our topsoil requirements. The soil compaction was not as much of an issue in this project as it would have been for some others, only because we know that we're going to come back and dig this all up in a couple of years. So we were able to do some modifications on that. And some other specification changes we had to make that were unique to this project were to protect the existing sewer infrastructure underground. So these are the type of maps that we provided to contractors that showed where the buildings they were going to be working on were located. So this is a map that was given to one of the traditional demolition firms. So we still tried to group buildings based on their location. So it was a combination of feasibility questions like this and building values preferences for which buildings they wanted to deconstruct. But these are some of those examples, and then zoomed in to show parcel access based on what properties we already own, and so where staging might be able to occur. And so I think the contractors really appreciated having these kind of detailed maps. And I think we'll definitely be doing that again in future phases. I also mentioned plan and profile drawing. This is a simple plan and profile. We stripped off all the other unnecessary layers just simply to show the contractors who might not be familiar just at a glance where the existing combined sewer pipe is. As I mentioned, it's 19.5 feet in diameter for most of this corridor. But what the upper portion of the diagram shows is also that it's very shallow. If you can't see the numbers there, at some point the top of the pipe is less than 5 feet from the surface. So that's a critical issue for us and really our primary concern on some of these demolition projects. So that added cost in some instances, which I'll talk about in a moment. We also conducted extensive community outreach. We sent out letters to not only the immediate neighbors, but people on both sides of the street, all the way up and down the corridor, as well as our existing stakeholder list, which includes over 200 local leaders, business owners, people who've come to meetings in the past, just to keep everybody informed. And we also put information on our website about when this project was happening, issued a press release, so had some coverage in the local media. So people knew what was going on, and they also were able to find out about some of the things that Building Value is working on. And again, we sent out in that letter detailed images and maps for the community so they would know which buildings were coming down. Contingency was an important part of our bids. Each contract was written in with 10% contingency because we knew there were going to be things we found in the field that we hadn't expected. Some of those examples include repairing catch basins, saw cutting foundations to reduce vibration, again, to protect the pipe. And then so after these three groups provided their bids back to us, we awarded the work for the low bidders based on the total group bid. And then we held one single joint pre-construction meeting at MSD for all the winning bidders. So everyone was on the same page, and they had a chance to meet our construction management crew and inspectors. I have not provided the actual dollar amounts because, again, there are so many unique elements of this project. I don't want people to get stuck on exact dollars. But bids for individual buildings range anywhere from 50% below to almost 200% above our internal estimates. So as I mentioned, it's very difficult to get accurate estimates on those before we actually go out in the field. But then again, the benefit of grouping the buildings, the total winning bidders came in anywhere between about 30% below our estimates to 6% above. So all told, the project came in 9% below our total estimates. And that's even though all these projects involved prevailing wage, which was a challenge at some time, but it was necessary for the work that was being done.
Okay, so this is a video of us pulling an architectural element off of that ideal deconstruction candidate. Gentlemen in the industry told me that large sections of building like this were saleable. I actually was not able to sell it, so he was wrong. But however, we were able to cut off. There was some decorative trim and cool stuff on that piece of building, which we ended up cutting off and salvaging the lumber of. We're using the excavator here basically as a crane. There's an eye hook on the bucket, and I've had some rigging made so we can use the excavator as a crane. And this kind of helps us keep our costs down by just having one piece of equipment on site doing everything. So let's talk about our method just a little bit. For this project, we used what most in the industry call it hybrid deconstruction or partial deconstruction. Basically, that's just using heavy equipment, generally an excavator, along with manpower, and not only manpower taking the whole building down by hand. So why would we use that method on this project? Really, there are a number of really strong reasons. Time and schedule and money being number one. This is the construction industry, big projects like this. You've got budget and schedule, and it's always going to be that way. This helps us stay more in line with the traditional demolition schedule and a traditional demolition budget. An additional challenge on this project was paying our workers prevailing wage. So, that really is easy to blow the budget when you're paying 5 or 7 guys on a site to take a house apart by hand. So that's another thing that pushed us towards it. And, the excavator, we already need it there in order to excavate the basements. It's the best tool for the job for backfilling the basements and doing the site work needed. So since it's already on site, why not go ahead and use it for other things? Here's another video. This just kind of shows, I think in the deconstruction industry, there's generally a negative view of an excavator, thinking that they're only for demolition. Here are operators pulling a large floor section out as we work, and he'll just kind of pull it aside out to safety where our crew can then hand disassemble it and get it stacked up and ready to load onto the truck. So, I mean, these machines are pretty versatile and capable of doing a lot. We found we could really bring our costs down by using the same piece of equipment to do everything. So what did we save? We had already gone through and removed doors, mantles, things like that. So we were mostly going after lumber. These were older houses, so it was a nice old-growth lumber. Got 25,000 pounds out of there, which was a pretty good haul for us. Generally, we sell about that's 7,500 board feet, and we generally sell a board foot of this older lumber for about $2 a board foot. So that's about 15 grand in salvage lumber, which is pretty good as well. Some of the challenges on this project, a big one with theft. This was before and during work. Kind of a really good example is this. There's a garage that was going to be demolished, and they had a car up on the roof, about half of a old Cadillac up on the roof, which looks pretty cool and everyone wanted to save. And before the project got started, someone actually went on the roof and stole the car off of the roof. So that's just an example of how brazen people can be. Obviously people are going to go through and steal the copper, but we also found that now they're starting to target architectural antiques. On our walkthrough, we'd have notes, get a mantle here, a cabinet there, and then when we went back, the mantles are gone and the cabinets are gone. So they're starting to target lights, mantles, and architectural antiques. Obviously, having a giant sewer pipe 5 feet below the surface when you got heavy equipment on site is a little dicey. Prevailing wage, as I mentioned before, was the challenge. Time and schedule. This was a pretty unique project in that the contractors kind of had to work together. There were portions where another contractor couldn't start demo until we were finished with ours. So it really put it to a whole nother level of having to be done on a timely schedule. And the walkthroughs, as I mentioned earlier, those are pretty time-consuming, going through 20-plus buildings, taking boards off and all that. They were dangerous as well. So, we had to do this prior to any kind of contract, so this was all, unpaid for us. And also resident safety. This is a pretty busy street we were working on with busy sidewalks. So when you've got giant equipment and trucks, obviously it's a challenge to, keep all the residents safe during the whole process. Some of the successes for us on this project, what was very helpful, Andrew showed a lot of those maps and things that they gave to us. Those were very helpful. Doing the abatement all in one big shot before we even bid on these jobs is very helpful. It's just one less thing to worry about. And on top of that, Keep Cincinnati Beautiful, they came in. They're a local organization. They came in. When we were finished with the site, we didn't have to put topsoil and seed and straw down. They just came back after we were all done and did all of the lots. So that was helpful, too. That way we could keep the project moving quickly. Community relations was hugely successful. We talked to lots of customers in our store, and they were just so happy to hear that a government entity actually cared about the buildings they were tearing down. When you're on site, you're talking to the neighbors and all the local residents. They're stopping by asking questions. And when they saw that we were saving things out of the buildings, it really turned around their view of Metropolitan Sewer District and what they were doing there. And just generally speaking, this is a really good area to do it in because the buildings were so old and there was lots of unique antique items in there. And on top of that, we got some great job training out of it while we were saving those items.
Touching base about what makes the deconstruction model work, when you look at it, it's probably not something somebody's going to go in business to do. One of the things I wanted to mention earlier is that we are a 501c3. We're a nonprofit, and one of the advantages that gives us is that any materials that we extract during a deconstruction project becomes a tax deduction for the owner of that material. So we feel it's critical to have that status so that you give incentive to people to donate their materials, whether it's a lamp that they're not using anymore or whether it's a house that they're going to be tearing down, and that material can be construed as donations to our organization. Having a working relationship, a successful relationship with organizations like the Metropolitan Sewer District, the Port Authority of Cincinnati, the Cincinnati Zoo, local contractors, is also very critical to having a deconstruction program that's successful. We fortunately or unfortunately have a huge stock of older buildings in Cincinnati. As Chris said, when you look at buildings that are over 100 years old, you tend to have much better building materials that have a higher salvage rate. Having a retail center allows us to find the buyers, and when you're offering the same service as demo contractors, but you're enabling folks to have a tax benefit from it, a green benefit from it, a sustainability benefit from it. As long as you market that correctly like you would in any business, you're reaching a huge scope of customers out there. Really two very critical elements. The retail outlet, as I mentioned earlier, it's a cash situation for us, converting salvage into cash, gives exposure to our program, and a big item is it helps us share our expenses, the overhead insurance. When we don't have a full docket of deconstruction work, we can have guys working in the store, keeping them employed, keeping them paid, and sharing resources. And as I mentioned earlier, just the nature of deconstruction allows you to effectively market to a wide and diverse audience, and it really has something that appeals to everybody. The salvage is consistent with sustainability folks. The workforce development for us has huge appeal for groups like the Metropolitan Sewer District in the city of Cincinnati who are really intent on putting people to work. It's paid employment, and so it's a workforce development program that is good for everybody. And we're offering stuff to people that they can't get anywhere else, so it's a big bonus for our retail application as well.
I know we're running out of time here, so I'm going to run through these last few slides quickly to leave some time for questions. But this is just an example of our hauling log that we gave to contractors. It was basically taken directly from the city of Minneapolis, which had been EPA pointed us to this as an example. So we used that and would use it again. I think we'd probably give some more specifics next time to make sure we got the answers we wanted. I know a lot of people have interest in the results that this of the waste streams that were generated by this project. As it turns out, about half of the total tonnage of this project was C&D debris, which still went to a landfill, but the other half was a mix of recycled concrete, clean hard fill, lumber, metal, etc. So the traditional demo firms are recycling concrete and metal as well, but there's a lot of other elements that aren't appreciated when you just look at tonnage. But basically, you see there at the bottom kind of what those rates come out to be when you actually look at the totals versus the original building areas. It's hard to compare one contractor to another just because they're different building types, different materials that are coming out of them. So looking at tonnage or volume of waste is really difficult. We also had to leave a lot of waste, or at least stone, behind in the ground to support sidewalks or roadways. And finally, our lessons learned. I won't read through all of them, but you can see for yourself kind of it was a big learning curve for us as a sewer district, learning a lot of these things. I've mentioned a lot of these already. One of the ones I do want to highlight, though, is that deconstruction is not cost prohibitive. Even selective deconstruction has immense value to a community. So even if you're able to incorporate that step, it would be a big improvement. Other lessons learned, we have a lot of bidders who've done multiple projects for us in the past, so anytime we make changes to a multi-page document, our specs are about 50 pages long, you have to make sure you highlight those and also highlight those for your internal field inspectors. Photos were important to us, knowing what's going to be in the ground after we come back. Cold weather caused delays, as I already mentioned, and utilities were one other thing we haven't mentioned yet, but coordinating with local utilities is key, because if you go out to the site or you go out with your contractor after they've already been awarded the work and the water hasn't been shut off like it was supposed to be, then you're into some pretty long delays, or you could be. So those are some of the basic lessons we've learned from this project. We'll be starting Phase B this summer, and we'll hopefully be able to continue working with EPA's researchers. And I hope everyone can come visit us by 2018 when this project will be complete. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Cincinnati. Lots of great information. Reminder to everyone that we will be sending you links to the recording of this webinar. We had quite a few questions come in. The ones that we can't get to, we will be providing answers in follow-up. One that may not have been covered exactly, just wanted to ask Cincinnati, what was the biggest variable to the cost estimating process? Someone had asked us that.
The cost estimating that we did internally was based on a square footage from the local auditor's website. So there was really, I don't know where the original cost per square foot number came from, but it was, the estimates were driven by square footage, and then additional things were added based as a percentage on top of that. So adding things for overhead, profit, bonding, escalation, those type of things were all based on percentages from that original dollars per square foot number that came out to be whatever it was.
Okay. Let's see. I actually will ask one other one. What type of environmental inspections need to be conducted before you start the deconstruction? What sort of inspections did you do?
Well, we tried to play it safe, and we not only did the inspections themselves, but we actually completed the abatement work even before any of the deconstruction occurred. There probably were buildings where there was either a few thermostats or things like that that needed to get removed that building value could have been totally safe to go in and do some of their other work without having those removed already, but just to make our lives easier and to make building value's lives easier, we just completed all the abatement before they were ever in one of the buildings to do any work. So we'd probably repeat that in the future.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining in, and you will be hearing from us follow-up to learn how to get the recording of this webinar as well as answer your questions that we didn't have time to answer now. So thank you.